Okay, Nick, we're now going to begin what I call my rapid fire questions.
I can't wait.
Sitting on the edge of your seat, literally. When did you first know you wanted to be an attorney?
That one I can be very specific about. Summer of 1968.
Wow.
And let me give you the context for that. Bobby Kennedy announced that he was going to run for president, and he was going to run in the primaries against Lyndon Johnson. 2 weeks later, Lyndon Johnson stepped down from the campaign and said he was going to concentrate on trying to end the Vietnam War. 2 days after that, Bobby Kennedy came to the Palestra at the University of Pennsylvania and gave a campaign speech. He was only into his campaign for 3 weeks at that point. And I was there, and I actually met with Bobby Kennedy. And it was an inspiring event. 2 days later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. The social fabric of this country was being torn apart. And in June of 1968, I was finishing up my sophomore year at Penn. I decided that the rule of law was really something that was necessary to keep this country socially intact. So I decided to become a lawyer at that point. And thereafter, I took as many undergraduate courses in law when I was a junior and senior, including from one set of courses from Henry Abraham, who's a world-class constitutional law professor. And that convinced me I wanted to become a lawyer and ultimately a litigator.
So I've got to ask you, I don't normally divert during this,
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
you know, you talk about the rule of law. We're obviously in what I'll call a precarious political situation in that
there's turmoil.
Turmoil, there is, and specifically as it relates to the rule of law, as it relates to due process. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about it, frankly. I think civility is currently under attack. And it's under attack by both sides of the political spectrum. We see it in the news almost daily. And that's something which is of great concern. You know, civility is a problem in the court system as well. You know, when I started out to practice law, there were no rules of civility, but they became necessary, and courts began to institutionalize civility rules. Why? Because lawyers were not being civil to each other or to the court. It's an astounding fact that this is something that we're living with today. And now this has spilled over into, and I'm not going to get into a political discussion, but it's become a very contentious point in our daily lives, in the media, in social media, in speeches that are being given, in efforts being made to incentivize supporters to, in some instances, commit violence against protesters, for example. So we're back to what I'll call the social upheaval. I don't think it's quite where we were in 1968 with the civil rights problems that we were experiencing at that time and the Vietnam War. Those were domestic attacks that we had internally to have to deal with. But we are now dealing with, I think, the second wave of the most social upheaval that this country has ever experienced.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I obviously wasn't around during the first one, but I mean, it's a unique time, to say the least.
It is a unique time.
Who is your favorite attorney, group of attorneys to litigate against?
Steve, I'll tell you that I've had a number of defense firms that I've litigated against over the years, and I almost could answer that question in the negative, which is to say, who would I not want to litigate against? But I'm not going to name them in this interview. But I will say that there are some people that I would put at the top of the list. And my friend Mark Mester, who kindly mentioned me in one of these interviews, I would put him at the top of the list. And I've also had some defense lawyers against whom we're litigating right now from the Reed Smith firm in Chicago, for example, a gentleman named Marty Bishop and his partner, Rebecca Hansen. Those are the types of people we enjoy litigating against, not because they agree with us, although I think internally they may sometimes, but it's a matter of accepting what they say and accepting it at face value.
Sure. You got to be able to trust the person on the other side of the table. Over the last 5 years, what do you think has been the biggest sea change in the class action landscape?
I would say that the assault on the doors of the courthouse being open is probably the greatest single attack on both investor rights and consumer rights. And that's the issue of arbitration. And I'm trying to, when you say 5 years, I think the Italian Colors case, for example, is I think within the last 5 years. Concepcion is within maybe the last 7 years. But those twin decisions involving class action waivers and involving what does it take to enforce an arbitration provision have been very critical. But I will tell you this, Steve, there is a rollback, like there usually is in the law. We see a cyclical situation. And for example, yesterday, the First Circuit came down with a decision involving the enforceability of an arbitration provision involving Uber. And it reversed a district court decision to enforce an arbitration provision and found that there had not been a sufficient meeting of the minds and an affirmation by the customer by using a website with clicks. And the court went through a very detailed analysis of what was on the website, what each window showed, what the clicks meant, how small the print was, in essence finding that there was no meeting of the minds and no enforceability of the arbitration provision was called for. So I think you're seeing courts roll back the general, yes, it's enforceable because it's somewhere in the small print.
Nick, do you have a favorite movie that deals with the law?
You know, I've seen some of your interviews,
right,
and I've heard some of the answers,
right,
and I love all the movies that have been mentioned. Not that I've seen all the interviews, but I think I've caught most of them.
Right.
Witness for the Prosecution is a 1950s genre movie with Charles Lawton and Tyrone Power and Marlene Dietrich. Billy Wilder was the director, who's a brilliant director. That's one. I think that's probably my favorite movie because it's law mixed into a mystery, right, and it really creates a dynamic that makes the movie move very, very swiftly with a lot of alacrity. So I find that to be an enjoyable movie if I can catch it. Another one which never takes place in a courtroom is 12 Angry Men,
sure,
which is a classic, and it all takes place, as you know, in a jury room on Foley Square in New York City. Great movie, great development of characters over a 90-minute period, and you've got just a terrific cast: Henry Fonda, Lee J. Cobb, I mean, E.G. Marshall. Just a terrific, terrific movie.
Sure, it's a classic. It really is. Okay, how about non-legal movies? Favorite movie?
The Magnificent Seven. I love Westerns. Okay. My dad was a World War II veteran. I love World War II movies. It's more genre than a particular movie, but those are the genres that I particularly enjoy.
Is there a particular book that you find yourself gifting over and over again that you like to pass on the wisdom from a particular book to either your associates, your friends, whomever?
About 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, Jonathan Harr had written a book about a civil action, nonfiction. I think he took 7 years to research it. He was embedded with the plaintiff's counsel, right, in that case, Jan Schlickman. Yep. And that is a book that I have given to almost all my associates at the firm over the years. And the reason I give it to them, because after you read it, if you still want to be a plaintiff's lawyer, right, then you've got the right stuff.
Right.
It's a book that has a lot of what I'll call encouragement, mm-hmm, but it also has some realities that are painful for a plaintiff's lawyer in particular. So I think that's a really good one for an aspiring plaintiff's lawyer, and it's probably a good book for any lawyer.
What class did you hate in law school?
Honestly, none. Because I'll tell you that I took some courses that I was not particularly interested in, okay, like a family law course. But the professor that was teaching it was a special professor. So that makes all the difference. You can take a course that's not particularly interesting or that you don't have a particular affinity to, but because of the particular professor who's teaching it, it becomes a subject that you become interested in. But I really enjoyed law school. I know that sounds strange, but
No,
I really
I
did.
loved law school. Well, much more than practicing, to be honest with you, or I'd probably still be practicing. But I loved law school. What do you identify as sort of the biggest growth area in class action law? What kinds of cases are we seeing more of? What do you think is interesting in the immediate future?
I think what you're going to see, Steve, is more ERISA cases. I think you're going to see more healthcare insurance cases. Consumer cases have always been out there, but I think because of the ascertainability challenges that you have, particularly in, like, let's say, the Third Circuit, where we're sitting right now, there may be a disinclination to file certain types of class actions in the consumer field. So I think you're going to see fewer of those cases where ascertainability is a real challenge.
Right. So the over-the-counter cases, those types of
Yeah,
things.
where you have no record of who the consumers are and people don't keep their receipts, that type of case.
Earlier you were talking about how the law is cyclical, and what I'm wondering is, given sort of the advent of new consumer technology and the big data and the point of sale ability to predict purchasers based on past purchasing behavior, if 5-10 years from now we're going to see data as the answer to the ascertainability problem. That's something that really has always interested me, and who knows, we'll see.
We will see, and if we continue to have the kinds of records that people are, in essence, maintaining with regard to each of their purchases or each of the clicks they make onto a website, yes, it may be ascertainable. But what concerns me about that, and it concerned the Supreme Court just a little bit ago, a week ago, is the right of privacy, and how the data being used for the type of use that you're talking about may bump into the right of privacy. The Carpenter versus United States case that the Supreme Court decided 5-4 establishes that for certain types of data, in this case cell phone usage and cell site records, invades the right of privacy. And what's interesting is the right of privacy really emerged just 50 years ago with Griswold versus Connecticut. There was no such thing as right of privacy under the Constitution, but now it's become a profound issue with the data breach cases and with this Carpenter decision that the Supreme Court just issued.
No, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, especially because, if you watched Mark Zuckerberg being grilled by Congress, it also seems to me that the legislature doesn't necessarily understand the new technology enough to legislate a solution just yet. So it's going to be a continual process, but I think that's a really good point. Which case was most detrimental to the plaintiff bar, Carrera, Concepcion, or Dukes?
Concepcion, I think, as you anticipated.
Right.
Yeah, Carrera is a workaround. First of all, it's a minority position. Sure. It's the Third Circuit. I think the 11th Circuit may have recently made a pronouncement in line with Carrera, but there are workarounds to the ascertainability issue, and that standard being required. The Dukes case, I know there are various views about whether its application goes beyond employment cases. One of the things that I think we have to recognize, sometimes bad facts result in bad law, and Dukes may be one of those examples where you have 1.5 million women who are part of the class, and how do you get the commonality that you really need in order to establish class certification as the ultimate result? I think Concepcion, I think it closes the courthouse doors, and that's a real problem. But as we talked about earlier, there are now inroads because the judiciary is getting tired of seeing meritorious cases getting thrown into arbitration where they know it's a black hole and there's not going to be justice.
One case I never asked about, primarily because it's so new and also because it's also minority position, but I'd just be curious to hear your take on it, is the Hyundai mile per gallon case.
Yeah, that case is going to be a pivotal one, not only in the Ninth Circuit, but nationally. I think that the key is going to be, number one, is the en banc petition, which is being sought by both sides. going to be granted. It's been pending now for at least 4 or 5 months. Are we going to, and there have been amicus briefs filed on both sides of the issue. I expect it will be granted, and when the decision is made, the ultimate issue is going to be, are standards different for a settlement class versus a litigated class action?
Exactly, right.
And if again, there's this roadblock set up to a settlement, then what the judges are in essence going to be doing is pressing the litigants into just further litigating the case and maybe going to trial. So be careful what you wish for if you're a judge, because you may end up with some very complex class actions going to trial because there's no settlement feasible if you can't pass muster under the more stringent settlement requirements.
Right. Careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Is there a particular legal nonprofit that's near and dear to your heart?
I sit on the board of several nonprofits that are in the legal arena. One that I think has done an absolutely fabulous job is the Public Interest Law Center here in Philadelphia. They were instrumental and at the forefront of the voter ID case here in Pennsylvania, which struck down the requirements that the legislature had put in place with regard to the right to vote. And more recently, they were at the forefront of the gerrymandering case, which resulted in the redistricting of the congressional districts here in Pennsylvania, which may very well have an impact in the midterm elections. So they're a terrific organization.
Would you advise the next generation to go to law school?
I have 5 children. I have 1 daughter. She's a lawyer, and that was almost a second career for her. I encouraged it, but I was frankly of the assumption that none of my adult children were going to become lawyers. They were all doing different things. But she decided when she was in her late 20s to go to law school. I encouraged that once she made that decision. And she's a practicing lawyer and she's doing a wonderful job. I would encourage anyone who's young and wants to have an impact on society to become a lawyer.
What do you think is the most beautiful courthouse in the United States?
Hands down, Santa Barbara Superior Court. I mean, I've been there, I've argued cases there. It is just out of this world in terms of the ambiance of, it doesn't even look like a courthouse, right, but it is more like a Mexican hacienda.
Really? I've never seen it.
It's fabulous, yeah.
Finally, if you had one piece of advice to impart on the next generation of lawyers, one poignant piece of advice, what would that be?
I would tell them that reputation is like pie crust. It can be broken and it can't be put back together. I think that integrity is the touchstone of any lawyer's practice and career. So if you're going to get into this practice, you need to assume you're going to be living in a glass house, and you need to maintain your integrity because that's all you've got. That's your currency.
Thank you so much for doing this, Nick. This was great. Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
Me too.